The audience applauded at the end the way audiences always applauded, warmly, fully, without any special weight. They had received what they came for, and they were glad of it. Then they put on their coats and went home, back into the winter night and the ordinary world that had been waiting for them outside the hall. Louis Armstrong walked off stage. A few months later, he was gone. The concert on that winter night in 1971 was the last one. The audience had no way of knowing. By the beginning of 1971, Louis Armstrong had been performing in public for more than 50 years. The career that had begun in the streets of New Orleans, with a borrowed cornet and a boy's determination to play anything that would hold still long enough to be learned, had passed through every phase that a musical life of that duration and that magnitude could be expected to pass through. The early years of discovery, the middle years of mastery, the later years of something that resisted the word decline, because what Armstrong was doing was not declining but concentrating, becoming more itself rather than less. He had survived a heart attack in 1959. He had survived pneumonia. He had survived the accumulated physical cost of what a trumpet demands of the human body over 50 years of daily use. The strain on the lips, the lungs, the cardiovascular system that is required to produce, night after night and year after year, the particular sounds that Armstrong had been producing since before most of the musicians of his era had been born. His doctors, by 1971, had been advising reduced activity for some time. The specific medical advice varied depending on whose account you follow, but the general direction was consistent. Armstrong should rest more, perform less, allow the body that had been in service to the music for half a century some period of recovery. Armstrong listened to this advice with the particular quality of attention that people give to advice they have decided not to take. He continued performing. Not because he was reckless about his health, and not because the money required it. Armstrong was not, by 1971, performing for financial necessity. He continued because the stage was the place where he was most fully himself, and the idea of removing himself from it, while he still had the music in him, was not one he was prepared to act on. Those who were in the room that evening, and who, in the months and years that followed, learned what the evening had been, described something that is common to accounts of last things: the retrospective weight that arrives after the fact, the quality of significance that an ordinary evening acquires when it turns out to have been the final instance of something. They remembered details that they would not have remembered from an ordinary evening. What song Armstrong played in a particular sequence, the precise quality of the applause after a certain piece, a moment when the room was unusually quiet, a gesture Armstrong made between songs. None of these things were unusual at the time. They became unusual afterward, when the evening had acquired the status that it turned out to have had all along. What the people in the room that night actually experienced, before the retrospective weight arrived, was simply a very good Armstrong concert. He played. The music was what the music always was, the product of 50 years of a musician being completely himself, fully formed, in possession of something that continued to be worth possessing. The room received it the way rooms receive something good, with attention, with warmth, with the quality of satisfaction that comes from receiving exactly what was promised and finding that the promise was worth making. Then the applause, and the bow, and the ordinary mechanics of an evening concluding. Armstrong said good night. The room applauded again. He walked off stage. He was hospitalized in March. He returned home in May, weaker. He died on the morning of July 6, 1971, in his home in Corona, Queens, quietly in his sleep, the way the people who had followed his health were not surprised by, though not the way anyone who had spent a lifetime watching him perform could quite reconcile with the man they had seen on stages across 5 decades. The world that received the news had spent 50 years with his voice and his trumpet. The absence was immediate and specific, and unlike most absences, because what was absent was a sound, and sounds, once they have been in a room, leave a particular kind of silence behind them. The concert on February 21, 1971, was at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel in New York City, a venue that carried its own particular weight in the history of American entertainment. A room that had held performances of every kind across decades, that understood the protocols of a formal evening with the confidence of long experience. The event was a dinner concert, the kind of engagement that Armstrong had been playing throughout his career. Not an arena, not a stadium, but a room of perhaps a few hundred people, the tables set, the evening structured around the combination of food and music that had always been part of the landscape of American entertainment. Armstrong walked out that evening the way he always walked out, with the particular quality of arrival that those who had seen him perform consistently described as one of the most immediately recognizable things about him. He didn't enter a stage the way some performers enter a stage, with a building approach, a constructed momentum. He simply appeared, and the room adjusted itself around his presence before anyone had consciously decided to do so. He was 69 years old. He had aged in the way that certain people age when the thing they have devoted their lives to has continued to demand everything from them without diminishing in return, visibly, in the body, in the face, but in a way that made the person more, rather than less, present. The trumpet was the same instrument it had always been. The voice, rougher now than it had been in the Hot 5 recordings, was, if anything, more itself than it had ever been. What he played that evening was the repertoire he had built across 50 years, the standards that had become his, the songs that audiences recognized and that Armstrong had made, through the accumulated weight of decades of performance, into something that was simultaneously the song and his relationship to it. He played them with the full attention he had always given to whatever room he was in. The all-stars behind him followed the way the all-stars had always followed, with the particular sensitivity of musicians who have played alongside someone long enough to feel the music before it arrives. The audience at the tables received what they had come for, and they were glad of it. The warmth in the room was real. The music was real. The evening was, by every account from those who were there, a fine performance. What the last performance reveals about Armstrong, not as an event, not as a fact to be catalogued, but as a window into the nature of his relationship to music and to his audience, is something that those who study his career return to with consistent attention. He was 69 years old, in uncertain health, advised by people who understood his medical situation to reduce the activity that his body was increasingly unable to sustain. He walked onto a stage at the Waldorf Astoria on a February evening in 1971, and played with the full attention and full warmth that he had brought to every stage he had ever stood on. He did this not because he didn't know what the situation was. He did it because the stage was what it had always been, the place where the music was real, where the relationship between the sound and the people listening was direct and unmediated, where the work of 50 years arrived at its purpose. The audience didn't know it was the last time. This is, in retrospect, one of the most important things about the evening, not because it made the performance better or worse, but because it preserved something. What the people in the room received was not a farewell. It was a performance, complete in itself, given fully, without the weight of finality that would have changed both what Armstrong gave and what the audience received. The music arrived at them unannounced, the way it had always arrived, and they received it the way they always had, and for the duration of the evening, that was the whole of the world that mattered. The 50 years of stages that preceded that February evening have been studied and written about and listened to and argued over in the way that great careers are argued over. Which period was best? Which recordings were essential? Which moments most clearly showed what Armstrong was capable of? All of this is legitimate. But what the last performance suggests is that the answer to some of those questions might be simpler than the arguments require. Armstrong was a musician who played music for people who were listening. He did this from the time he was a teenager in New Orleans until the February evening in 1971, when the audience put on their coats and went home, and he walked off stage for the last time. The music was the point. It was always the point. The audience that night had no way of knowing. They applauded the way audiences always applauded, and then they went home. But the music they heard on that February evening was the last music Louis Armstrong would play in public. It was complete. It was real. It was given fully to whoever was there to receive it. Which is all it had ever needed to be, which is all it had ever been.